latest news.
You are within my power now, and you will hear my message. The esports pool's hive mind has penetrated your mortal dimension. Their advanced integrated alien precog signal centers beam the finest esports fantasy embedding to your reality. You can even get your dopamine release during live matches, as humans are wont to do. Now leave us. 2017 has seen the rise of a new breed of Counter-Strike team, an approach to constructing a Counter-Strike team, which is most simply described as simply multinational squads. Teams which don't take into account cultural considerations, language overlap, any kind of experience or history playing together, and therefore it's not the same as when a Norwegian player might play, as Rubino did with Dignitas and North, with a Danish team, or where a Norwegian player might play with a Swedish team, or an Austrian player might play with a German team. Those have some kind of a connection, some kind of a link, at least some kind of tenuous starting point where you're not just beginning at zero and then hoping to bridge a gap that currently no one's bridged. So obviously, this is not a new concept. It has existed in the past, but 2017 is the year where we really saw this pushed and become a viable strategy for multiple teams, and generally a blueprint which can be seemingly followed and have a certain degree and certain type of success. So obviously, the Kingwin team that Makalele formed with Fox and Rain and Scream and Wheaton, where it was Kingwin, and then they were bought out by G2 Esports, and later on became Faze, and obviously only Rain remains from that lineup within the Faze team. That squad proved the concept that you could put together talents or big names from diverse backgrounds, and actually a detail that I revealed in my Makalele reflections was that actually Hiko and Skadoodle, once Hiko had left Cloud9 and Skadoodle had avoided being banned like the other iBuyPower players, they were actually tentatively going to be part of that G2/Kingwin team originally, but they obviously chose to go a different route when Skadoodle joined Cloud9, and Hiko initially joined Nealum, but later on found his way into Team Liquid. So the concept was and is that in that particular case, none of those talents, despite the fact that most of them were good players, are average to above average pros, and they certainly had big names collectively. None of them had, at that exact moment, the opportunities or circumstances at home domestically to get the same level of play or same level of notoriety with domestic teams, or get onto the same trajectory to succeed and be in a top level, top 10, top 15 level team at that exact moment as they did by joining this multinational squad. And that's the key dynamic principle, which after we've seen it proven out and that it works, has now been applied by multiple different teams on different levels as well, crucially. And hence I expect to become a pattern going forwards, because in the case of a team like the Kingwin G2 team, they either were people who came from a country which didn't have a background or infrastructure to support a current top team at the time. So we think of like Rain, for example, who'd been in some okay teams, but nowhere near top 10 or ever going to finish highly in tournaments, obviously coming from Norway. Then we had Fox coming from Portugal. Obviously no Portuguese team has ever been internationally relevant in CSGO or CS 1.6 for that matter. And so he obviously was a much bigger name than everyone else in the Portuguese scene, and still had a decent level to where he could join these superstars and play at a much higher level. Or there were players who, at that exact moment at least, were on the outs in a scene which does have top teams, does have infrastructure. So the obvious examples in that team were Scream, who absolutely is one of the great players in CSGO history, but at the time, this is before 2016 where he went ham with Shocks, he'd been considered a problem child anywhere within the French scene, and he'd lost out on his chance in Titan/Very Games. The guys in the super team of LDLC and Envious didn't want him, so there was no way to get into the top two French/Belgian teams. Therefore, why not go for this international team that at the very least is going to get you exposure, money, and also potentially playing with these other good players gives you another chance to get to the top. Another example obviously is Makalele, who who'd he had his time in NIP. Earlier than that, he'd been in LGB. Currently, there were no top Swedish teams who wanted him. There wasn't actually the same groundswell of young Swedish talent that we later saw with the Epsilon guys, etc. And so he didn't really have anywhere to go, and hence wanting to make this project. And so these are players who, because they're on the outs with their domestic scene, but they're good players, they want a platform from which to showcase their skills, maybe get back on the shop window to potentially be signed by some of those top domestic teams, and in the meantime, make money, have fame, and hopefully once you get the core of the team together and you make the right chop and change, you can actually have international success here as well, as opposed to if it means domestically you're going to be playing either domestically in Tier 2 or Tier 3, or in domestic teams which on an international level are only Tier 2 and Tier 3, and therefore aren't going to many big lands, aren't getting you much salary, aren't building your brand and your exposure for your personal name and your growing your fame there, and then also aren't competing at the highest level, and therefore there's not really any reason to stay there. So these players banded together had more star power. They had star power already, but put together even more star power as a squad, which brings more fan interest together. It bands that together. It also increases the likelihood, as we saw eventually with teams like this, that you'll get invites. It's more likely you get an invite than if you're in a Tier 2 or Tier 3 team that comes, it's like the third or fourth team in Sweden. It's less likely you're going to get invited to a big event. But if you can pull together all these big names with a big fan interest and also the hype surrounding what will they do with all these big names, then people will start to potentially invite you to tournaments without having to qualify and go through that gauntlet that some of those online qualifiers were back then and even worse are now. So, I mean, we've seen top-level teams like G2, Gambit have been unable to get through a lot of these online qualifiers this year. And at LAN, these are top 4, top 6, top 8 teams at different points in time. Then, you also obviously get to play with stronger teammates. Now, obviously, you have to contrast that with reasons why in the past you wouldn't have made that a priority. So obviously before, you wanted to have the same language as people so you could communicate very easily and in depth and work on problems. So obviously being able to work on problems will allow you to artificially create team playing tactics with lesser players, which might end up being better for you. Like some of the past Dignitas lineups when they couldn't get any of the players that were in the Astralis team and they had all the best players over there. Likewise, there's a cultural shared overlap where you want people who you at least understand where they're coming from and you know what type of person they are, and you know when they say something, what that probably means with all the social markers and context that you've grown up in that you might not understand from other countries, as we saw when Simple went to Team Liquid, and when we had these different players in different squads, Na'Vi obviously bringing in Guardian from Slovakia. Likewise, stylistically, if you come from Denmark, you're going to play a tactical style, you're going to have a role assigned to you, you're going to work your way up, you're never just going to be the one guy who everything's based around you. But if you come from Russia, perhaps that is exactly how you're going to play. And so historically, you didn't want to bring in these players who come from a totally different world from you. So even though they're playing the same game, they're playing it and conceiving of it and modeling the game in such a radically different way. It's going to be really hard to integrate that and work with them because everything you're going to try and second guess about them might be entirely off. So there's also the factor that when you went to these other domestic teams, the logic was if I showcase my skills here, if I upset the big team or I play particularly well, I can also work my way back up the traditional hierarchy to get back to the top teams domestically, like someone like a Scream or a Makalele might have liked to do. So that's kind of this approach of having the multinational team is kind of a short circuit to that. You can't say, I won't go that traditional route up. I'll try and go sideways and go up and maybe get back in that way or just go up and join those teams on the same level as peers. So you can perhaps short circuit it or skip ahead of it if it works. Then you've got to consider that you also, when you can put together enough good players, and that's the problem in the past, you wouldn't have been able to get 3 or 4 or more of these players. You might have had 1 or 2, and then you'd have had to go with the domestic core, kind of like Nico did with Mouse Sports and Chris J. But if you can get together 4 or 5 of these players with name value, with skills, who, for whatever reason, are outsiders, they're in some way pariahs in their community, their talent and ability alone can, especially in CSGO, I don't think it would have worked in CS 1.6, quite frankly. It was much more tactical game based, a lot more positionally, and had more of a kind of set flowchart to how you had to play the game that both teams understood. I don't think it would have worked with this much individual talent, but in a world where you can get these individual talents together, you can hope that that raw individual talent can make up for the fact you likely will have weaker team play than a domestic team, the tactics than a domestic team, etc. Obviously, understanding of each other culturally, ability to get along, sheer teammate bonding and morale, etc. You hope that the raw talent is going to make up for this, and you're going to gun your way out of a lot of problems. Now, obviously, there was a classic example in 1.6, which was NOA. I did a video about them, who had this team, which was 3 Norwegian players, and it was a player from Canada and a player from the United States of America. Well, that was a very special set of circumstances. That was more akin to what's happened now with Faze, but they just started out like that. There was a degree to which some of these qualities were present, and in the first lineup it was a little bit more like that, but that was very much a one-off. It was an outlier. Other teams did not follow that blueprint. Even that team itself had to break up after even having some pretty big success, because it just wasn't tenable at that point in time with the infrastructure of where esports was, the amount of money it would cost to do that sort of thing. There wasn't as much ability to market to big fan bases and make a lot of money from sponsorship and from being able to have fan engagement. There wasn't social media to the same degree. So understandably, that was a one-off in history. Now, the past 2 Faze lineups have taken this concept and gone even further with it. So the lineup where they added Nico into the team, right, already that had become a pretty good team because it had Carrigan, and he'd pieced it together to be a playoff team and to be a team on the brink of being like a top 4 or 5 team and making it to top 8 at majors and being consistently pretty decent and having a wider map pool and making use of all these players who'd been outcasts. But when they added Nico, that took the concept to a higher level, because now you had a player who, if he had have been a Swedish player or a Danish player, would never leave his domestic scene because he's the best player from his country, from his region. But because he's an outcast, an outlier in this sense, a pariah in as much as he just doesn't have a big domestic scene that could ever support him and his talents to put him in a position to win championships, now you add him to a team like this, a legit superstar, top 4, top 3, top 2 at different times player in the world, with a team that's already got these talents and already has a good legit in-game leader who's already made the jump to one of these teams. Now you've got a team that already was capable of being number 1 in the world, capable of making massive finals, winning big tournaments, could have won a major, were in the running to have won a major potentially. But then again, as much as you might have thought, right, that's about as far as you can go with this principle. No, we've actually seen now the principle has been taken to its ultimate zenith, which has to be the current Faze lineup. They have an all-time great in-game leader combined with a fantastic cadre of talents, a number of whom have been the best player in the world at different points in time, a number who, at this point in time, don't even have to play internationally if they don't want to do. Olaf Meister can be in the best Swedish team. Rain's actually the one example who remains the same case. Guardian you can make a case for, but obviously all those CIS teams absolutely want to play with him. You learn to integrate in there. Then you obviously have to go and look at someone like, who am I thinking of now? Well, that's it actually. That's the 5 players. So it's someone like Olaf Meister moving over is a big step forwards and shows that this has become a pattern. It's not just a one-off anymore. So you think of, okay, weren't there teams like this in the past? Right? 2016 Mousesports might seem like it because yes, for most of the year, they had Nico, Bosnian player. They had Chris J, Netherlands. They had the 3 German players. That doesn't really count, though, because realistically, that was a German team. It was a main 3 players who were German players who played together in German lineups. They had Chris J, who, because he came from the Netherlands, had actually always played with Germans pretty much, and obviously, being Dutch, at least understands some of the basis of German culture and German language. I mean, unfortunately, thanks to World War II, a little bit more perhaps than he might like to. And then they basically added Nico in, who already was one of the ultimate outliers by being a godlike player, but from a country that never could have supported him on any kind of a realistic scale. And so they were very good, but that was mainly a German core team with Nico. That doesn't really count, I don't think, as this kind of true multinational revolution that we've seen now. Yes, from late 2016, it started to morph into one of these teams when they realized, why even keep the German players? Why not start to get these other players? Like, why not bring in Oscar, this amazing talent from Czech Republic, who obviously, again, doesn't have a scene that can support him? Why not bring in Lowell and try him out? We've already seen what Mixwell did in NA. Maybe Lowell can be that in for this Mouse Sports team. Then, obviously, the teams they had after that and after Nico just took this formula to where it is now. They brought in Sonny from Finland. They brought in Rops from Estonia. They brought in Oscar again from Czech Republic back to the starting lineup. And so Mouse Sports developed into one of these squads like a Faze, but maybe Faze back before they had Carrigan, when they still had talent, but they weren't going to make the super deep runs necessarily. Then obviously you had, within the German scene, another team went down this path. We had Penta, who had been a primarily German team. In fact, a number of the Mouse Sports players who were German had come from Penta. And they went with this very diverse squad. They had Finns, they had Sonny, they had an Estonian in HS, they had a German in Crystal, obviously one of the legacy players, they had a Pole in Innocent, they had this squad of players. They also had Zen as well, who was obviously from Finland. So they had this, again, diverse mix of players where it made more sense than picking any of those players' domestic teams and picking even the best domestic team of those and making that the Penta squad. Because for Sonny, for HS, for Innocent, that Penta squad represented a much better chance to succeed and did give them a better chance to succeed. They made it into a major than any domestic squad from Finland or Estonia or Poland. Now, the Poland one, you could maybe make the case it was close, but Innocent had tried out in those Polish teams to make it to a higher level than they'd gotten to for so many years that it was worth just going sideways on that one in the hopes of then getting a little bit better, which I would argue they did by making the major. Now then, you look this year, we've seen the Optic team go down this path. So they went from trying with this NA squad for so long to make it work and to get that final piece to replace Stanislaw, to bring out all the talent. And in the end, they decided, right, shed the NA talent, let it go to other teams like Cloud9. And instead, we're going to make one of these European multinational teams and we're going to have Freiburg. Obviously, he wasn't in any position to join a top Swedish team after being kicked from NIP. We're going to have Magisk. Now, funnily enough, he could have gone to Heroic, the third best Danish team, who you could argue is on a similar level, but he chose to go with the bigger salary, perhaps, or with the bigger names, and to go for the daring risk of this challenge, because while Heroics is good, they don't have as much of a ceiling really there. And even in Heroic, your main goal probably is to play well enough again to get the notice of North, of an Astralis, and hope you get back in those teams. That's more like the traditional way of working your way up the ladder. He's trying to go sideways and go up as people like Scream have at certain times in their histories. So then you had Alu, right? This was a better team than any Finnish team Alu was going to join. Sure, he could have gone and joined Mouse and Penta as well, so that's kind of a sideways move for me. You could argue Mouse would have been better, but for whatever reason he chose the Optic squad, probably more money, quite frankly. And then Mixwell, I think it's somewhat comparable for him because, yes, it's much better than any Spanish team could have been, but he had the NA connections and he had the NA street cred as a good teammate and a good player and a versatile player that he could have definitely been in an NA team, and I think it would have probably been a similar level to this Optic one, assuming it was a top 3 NA team. Now, what people don't mention when they look at what FaZe became and the top level of what you can do here, where you really could be the best team in the world, and in terms of FaZe, you could even maybe one day end up being the best team of all time. Sure, still a distance to go there, but they've got a great little track record and resume already. Now, in light of that, why can't these teams like Penta and Mouse Sports and Optic, why can't they get up to that level? That's the problem, okay? Because they aren't at the level of either of the FaZe lineups of this year, realistically. They've shown moments of potential in terms of the Mouse Sports team, but realistically, they're not close to that level of being in the big finals all the time, winning the big tournaments, or potentially winning a major. And part of that is on 2 levels. First of all, you can look at how FaZe put it together. Now, go from the back end and see when FaZe became truly superstar, world-class level squad was when they got Nico, because that's when they had a true world superstar. They had Nico. None of these teams, Mouse, Optic, Penta, had a true superstar on that level. Now, Oscar, you could argue he's not that far. He's definitely a very good player and he can have massive performances. But when we're talking about the greatest players in the world, even seeming that far off, that can be the biggest distance in the world because you've got all these other really good players. And if they're all that far off, you're going to consistently be better as a Nico, a Simple, a Coldzera, whoever it might be, a Device. It's just going to put you enough further ahead that not having that superstar is significant. Then you go and look, okay, maybe Rops can still develop into it. He's so young, he's so inexperienced, he's already starting to come on leaps and bounds. Maybe one day he could be there, but he's not there right now. Sonny has his moments of looking really good, or he has his good tournaments or his good series, but his style and the fact that he actually does look like a reasonably complete player suggests to me the ceiling's probably not too much higher. He seems like he's somewhat the player that he's going to be, and he's just going to play at this good level, and he's probably more suited, a la Rain in FaZe, to be like your third best player. I think that's the sweet spot for Sonny, and then he can have massive impact and put you over the top. In Optic, you could make a case that if Magisk could ever return to the type of form he showed in autumn leading into the December and into winter rather of 2016, that he could be a true superstar because he was right up that level for a solid 2 or 3 months, but he hasn't been in that level for a year now. In Optic, he's shown nowhere near that level of form. So no, they haven't got the true superstar. So that alone is going to hurt you from the top end of the equation. Where, meanwhile, you contrast that with FaZe, right? They've got Nico, who is a godlike superstar player, top 3 in the world. So they've already got someone as good as any player who's in any other team of any non-multinational status, never mind the multinational squads, then they have pieces which normally in this sort of a multinational squad would be like your Oscar, your Sonny, your Rops, like Rain. Now he would be a star player rather in a normal multinational squad, as he was in Faze in the past. He would be a star player in practically any team that isn't top 3 in the world right now. That's how they would use him. But he doesn't have to be used as a star player. In fact, he's much more of a role player in this Faze team. And that's why when he then puts up monster numbers in a team that has Nico, a true superstar, and has Guardian, no wonder the team's so fucking good. So this is a luxury that these other squads that are definitely good and have good skilled players and a good distribution of skill with these diverse multinational lineups they can't boast a player like Rain as like the second or third best player in their team. Then you go and look at a team like a player like Guardian. Absolutely Guardian, if he went to another team from practically anywhere, would have the team built around him. He would be the best player in the team. He would probably be a top 10 player in the world. And again, he doesn't have to be that in Faze. That's how much luxury of superstar firepower they actually have in their teams. Then you go from the bottom up and you look at how you build up a team. You want a great in-game leader, right? These teams don't even have a true traditional in-game leader. They're just using players who are just taking the role on at the moment. So you have no one comparable to Carrigan, a guy with massive experience, worked with so many different types of players, been successful with so many different types of players, now has proven that he can really fit this multinational approach because his style is to fit around the star players and to have a looser style to integrate their own individual brilliance. Obviously, his ability to create pick-ban advantages also helps out these multinational squads, which tend traditionally not to have the deepest map pools in the scene, although Carrigan obviously has been OP and a luxury in that sense of creating them for them, and at least in as much as I've always thought, he's never had the true super deep map pool, but his pick-ban advantages and ways of throwing the opponent off allow it to seem like that, because it means that you can't know what map you're going to play against him, even when he's not as strong on those maps. And that's why he's able to at least give his team chances on those maps typically. Which, funnily enough, you actually saw in the lost IEM Oakland final, where on the maps that they couldn't really play and weren't as good on, they were still getting 10 rounds because he was creating scenarios of, well, I'm not going to go to this map, and okay, we can play on this one, and we can get something out of this. And they could have won one of those maps. You've got to be realistic and say that. Now, it would be very different for these squads, even without the superstar play, because, yeah, it's going to be hard to get a simple cold zero to join these teams when they can just go to teams in their own region. You're lucky enough that Faze got Nico. I think that's kind of an outlier. That's one area I don't really see a lot of these teams getting those superstar players, but maybe they can get the odd one. Now, one thing you can do, though, is get these great in-game leaders, and that's where I feel like it would be different for these squads. If they had a Sean Gares, if they had a Gobby, if they had an Existence, an MSL, proven in-game leaders with a long track record who want to be in-game leaders, who know how to make use of their pieces, who have their own stylistic approach to the game, will get the best out of their players, and also will be good at recruiting players in theory, then you will start to cook with gas for these squads and they'll start to win tournaments. That's where you'll get to the Carrigan and Faze before Nico level, and then if you develop an Oscar or a Rops into that star player or Megas, now you can get to the Faze with Nico level, but without the Olaf Meister and Guardian one, where you can still be one of the best teams in the world. You might even be the best team in the world. Now, interestingly enough, they haven't been able to get the talents and services of these good in-game leaders, but I think that is the future for these types of squads, because people are going to keep doing these types of squads, and sooner or later, there's going to be a high enough salary offered by one of these squads that one of these in-game leaders is going to say, okay, I'll sign up for that. I'll take this for 6 months or a year and see how it goes. Likewise, these in-game leaders are going to eventually be willing to take more chances, because actually all the names I listed there, except MSL, are stuck with much more inferior squads to these teams we're talking about domestically, and trying to make teams work over in their own little regions and own little worlds and grinding away and putting in great hours and efforts, but not getting as much success as they might. And one day I think we'll realize if they were with these big international squads, or at least talented international squads if they're not the big names. So there'll be in-game leaders who also just want a new challenge. They've tried being an NA in-game leader or a German in-game leader or a Danish in-game leader, and they say, you know what, fuck it. I'm going to try being like Carrigan and taking on one of these multinational squads and see what happens when it happens. Also, you can add in, perhaps they get towards the end of their career and they say, you know what, I'll play one more year in CS, so I can't really build anything now. So I want to take on kind of a retirement lap. I want to get paid a lot of money. I want to have a chance to win now or do something cool with players I've never played with. Maybe I go to an Optic or a Penta or a Mouse Sports or whoever it might be at this point in time. Because I think that these talents who aren't Faze, the multinational squads, they've gone as far as their talent can take them. That's all they basically do right now, is live and die riding on their talent. They need good in-game leaders. They hopefully need superstar players, but that's a luxury you cannot just demand and seek out necessarily. And they need proper coaching staff, quite frankly, to make use of and hopefully build in some artificial structure where these players from such diverse backgrounds, culturally, language-wise, stylistically, experience-wise, won't be able to naturally have that in the way that you can typically hope to have with either a core in a domestic scene or adding the right players and testing them out and then putting them into a squad. I actually think, funnily enough, that the rise of these multinational teams is also why you don't see that many of the good European players willing to go to North America. I mean, now you already have teams they can go to in Europe that aren't domestic. So why would they go to North America? This is actually part of the reason where I actually think some of these players would have given NA a gamble, but there's no point because NA is further away, there's more travel, you can't live at home with your support network or your friends and family, the salaries are as good in these European multinational squads, or it's negligible, contrasted with those negatives, if you're in NA, that you'll just stay in Europe. You're also probably going to have more respect for the players in Europe. You know that they're good players, they just happen to be in bad scenes. You're not having to go and join an NA team where you're not quite sure what the ceiling of the players is. You might even have a history of playing against these players in games in Europe or in FPL with them or against them. So one of the interesting things as well is not only are these teams going to continue and people are going to keep taking these gambles, and in fact those teams might be improved and become some of the top teams. We might live in a world where the top 10 teams in the world have 4 or 5 multinational squads instead of Swedish team, Danish team, American team, Brazilian team. Maybe we'll have these multinational squads along with the best from those traditionally good regions. I also think this is going to have an impact on the domestic scene, and that's part of the reason why you won't have as many of the second or third Danish teams necessarily in the top 10. Because someone like Magisk, in the traditional world of Counter-Strike and transfers and people being cut and added to teams, he would have just gone and joined Heroic because he was in the second best Danish team and he got cut. Therefore, he would go to Heroic where they need a player of his talents. They could build around a player of his talents. They just lost one in Valde. Traditionally, he would go there and they even have a decent amount of money at either Heroic or the team below, and he would try and work his way back up. Likewise, Kiyashima traditionally would have gone to Envious if you wanted the big salary to play with the other rejects. Or he'd have gone to LDLC if you want to play with Existence and try and build something and get back to a good level, but for less money. Instead, they don't do this. They go to these international squads, as he did with FaZe, as Megas did now with Optic, or they wait for chances like Kiyashima seems to be at the moment. Likewise, on a lower level, Deva Duek and Amanek, in a sane world, they would have been on LDLC, right? Instead, they took the risk to go to Misfits for more money, more fame, more opportunity. I mean, why would they stay with less money and opportunity? In terms of opportunity, I mean as in having to play in like EU qualifiers and against EU Pro League versus NA qualifiers and NA Pro League, where you got a much better chance of making it to the LAN with those NA players. Why would they stay and play for an LDLC and be an okay team online and never really do anything offline and probably not have much of a ceiling to go anywhere, as opposed to showing off their talents in Misfits? They've already had a way bigger platform over there. I think likewise, Czechoslovakia obviously doesn't exist as a country, but the countries that made some of that up, that would have its own team in that region by now, I think, personally. I think Guardian would have gone after retiring from Na'Vi, and he said, right, I'm going to go and I'm going to play with Stiko and Zero and maybe Oscar and then maybe another player, Quest One, whoever it might be, and we're going to actually make our own team and we're going to try and build up that region. That's not going to happen because why would he? Guardian cannot play in FaZe. Stiko can play in Mouse Sports. Oscar can play in Mouse Sports. There's no point these players going and making their domestic scene better with the best team, but still not that amazing a team internationally. I think smaller countries are going to lose the only talents they had. So you saw Estonia's had now a couple of good players and it's lost them. Norway has actually one of the best players in the world. It's lost him. Finland has a couple of good players. They can't get any of them to stay in Finland. Netherlands has Chris J. He's not going to be playing for a Dutch team anytime soon. Spain might get Lowell back. They're definitely not getting Mixwell back, it would seem, unless he really just gives up on the top scene. This is the way forwards for players outside of countries with massive talent depth and good infrastructure and top-level teams. So I want to see, once you go beyond Brazil, and once you go beyond NA, and once you go beyond Sweden and beyond Denmark, and you start to get those countries which either have one good team, like Poland, or they don't have a top team and they have a couple of good players. I want to see what happens there with whether or not these players come to these international teams, because it seems almost certain they will. And even more than that, as I said with the case of France and Denmark, scenes that are deep and with history and with good players at all levels, what happens to those second or third teams, those Heroics, those LDLCs? do they end up getting some of the good talent that gets kicked out the top teams? Or do those top players say, I want to still be a known player, I want to get a high salary still, I'm going to go to these multinational squads? Finally, forgetting the player side of the equation, which is obviously very attractive, I think these squads are very attractive to potential owners as well, and current owners, because they allow you to market to multiple countries, demographics and fan bases, as opposed to one. Likewise, they allow you to bring bigger names all together instead of one big name and a few good players from the domestic region. Get a bunch of big names together. Now you have a bigger collective social media engagement, fan engagement. It's also easier to replace players. If we're just looking for a good player, we can get them from a bunch of countries, as opposed to being tied to one scene, like, for example, the tough decision Hastro had to make with his Envious squad. Once the French Shuffle happened, and he lost the French Shuffle, and he was left with a bunch of the rejects, he could have instead, if he'd have seen what happened this year, signed a Faze-esque team like a Mouse Sports, like an Optic type squad, and then started to build that up with the big money that he has to offer them, instead of just reinvesting in Envious, which for the money they've been paid has been very underwhelming actually, and doesn't seem to have much of a ceiling. Likewise, Optic in the past, as they did, tried with that NA lineup for a whole year. They wasted the majority of a year. They weren't going anywhere. They had good players, but they were just whiling away in their team. And clearly they couldn't find the in-game leader to make it work. So why keep sticking with NA? Why not go with the multinational squad and instantly have a team that's as good, or perhaps got the ceiling and trajectory to be better than the NA squad was?
Yo, this is Alup. You got pretty big balls to watch Thorin's YouTube videos.